Picture this. It's Sunday night, you've got your laptop open, and you've somehow ended up with 11 tabs open. One comparing dividend funds, one titled something like, "This portfolio will change your life," and one half-finished spreadsheet you started back in the spring and never touched again. Quick note before we go further. This video is for educational purposes only and is not financial advice. Nothing here is a personal recommendation, so treat it as a starting point for your own research, not a substitute for talking to a licensed financial professional. I'm Liam, and I spend an unreasonable amount of time thinking about why some people reach retirement calm and unbothered, while other people, often smarter, more careful, more read-up people, end up anxious and stuck, endlessly fiddling with a plan that was never actually broken. Today I want to walk you through something that might feel almost too simple to be true. The retirement portfolios that actually work, the ones that let people sleep fine during a rough market, are almost always small and plain. Meanwhile, the portfolios that quietly fall apart are usually the packed, complicated ones. By the end of this, you'll probably look at your own account differently, hopefully with a lot less anxiety, not more. Let's talk about a belief a lot of people carry around without ever saying out loud, the idea that a serious investor needs a complicated portfolio. If you only own 2 or 3 funds, some quiet voice tells you that can't possibly be enough. Real investors surely have 20 positions, a hedge against inflation, maybe some private deal a coworker mentioned once at lunch. I want you to meet Derek. Derek isn't one specific person. He's a composite of a lot of people I've spoken with over the years, and there's a decent chance parts of him sound familiar. Derek's careful. He reads financial statements for fun, which, respectfully, is a little unusual, but I admire the dedication. Over about 4 years, Derek slowly built up his account. Individual company stocks, a few sector funds, a couple of actively managed mutual funds an old advisor talked him into, some bond funds, a gold fund for insurance, and a commodities fund he genuinely couldn't explain the reasoning for anymore. By year 4, Derek had 23 separate holdings. And here's the part that stings a little. When he finally sat down on a quiet Saturday and actually mapped out what he owned underneath all those different names, he found that around 18 of those 23 holdings were basically the same handful of large companies, just wearing different labels. He'd paid extra fees, taken on extra paperwork, and created extra mental clutter to recreate something close to a plain broad market fund, just far less efficiently. That's what I'd call the complexity trap. And it's sneaky because it doesn't feel like a trap while you're in it. It feels responsible. It feels like diligence. Every new holding feels like another brick in a fortress. But past a certain point, and that point comes a lot sooner than people expect, extra holdings stop adding protection. What they actually add is overlapping risk you don't fully understand, fees you're not tracking closely, and mental overhead that makes you far more likely to panic and abandon your plan the moment markets get rough. Here's why this matters to you specifically. If you're currently holding 12, 15, 20 different positions, there's a real chance you're not more diversified than someone with 3 well-chosen funds. You're just more confused. And confusion is expensive. It's what makes people sell at exactly the wrong moment, freeze instead of rebalancing, or keep paying an ongoing fee to manage a mess that never needed to exist in the first place. So here's something worth doing today, not eventually. Log into your actual account, not from memory, and count your holdings. If that number surprises you, that's useful information. You don't need to fix anything this second, just notice it. So if complexity is the trap, what does the alternative actually look like? Because keep it simple is the kind of phrase that sounds nice, printed on a poster, but doesn't mean much until you see it applied for real. Here's roughly what a lot of the sturdiest, least dramatic retirement portfolios have in common: a broad domestic stock fund, a broad international stock fund, and a bond fund, mixed in proportions based on your age and how much risk you can stomach. That's genuinely close to the whole thing for a huge number of people. Some add a 4th piece, maybe a real estate fund, maybe a small cap tilt. But the skeleton stays the same. Own broadly, in reasonable proportions, and let time do most of the work. Think about it like cooking. Someone who's insecure about their cooking tends to throw in 15 ingredients, extra spices, a splash of this, a spoonful of that. because more ingredients feels like it must equal more flavor. But the sauce that actually makes someone close their eyes at the table is usually tomatoes, olive oil, garlic, salt, maybe basil. 4 or 5 things, done with attention, and then left alone to become what they're supposed to become. Piling on more doesn't make it better. It just muddies it. Retirement portfolios work the same way. The core ingredient is broad ownership of the economy's productive engine, companies across the market, combined with enough stability from bonds that you're not forced to sell your stocks during a downturn just to cover your bills. When you own a total market-style fund, you already own tomorrow's biggest winners. You don't have to be the person who discovers the next great company, because the moment it becomes big enough to matter, it's already sitting inside the fund you already hold. You just need to own the whole ocean instead of trying to catch one specific fish. That single shift removes a genuinely enormous burden. You're not required to predict the future. Nobody is. Not the fund managers charging ongoing fees to try, and not the finance channel with the flashy thumbnail promising the next big thing. What you can actually control is cost, consistency, and time spent invested. A simple portfolio lets you pour your entire attention into exactly those 3 things instead of scattering it across stock picking, timing the market, and chasing whatever fund is trending this month. If you're building this yourself, the practical version looks like this. Pick a small number of low-cost, broadly diversified funds that together cover domestic stocks, international stocks, and bonds. Set a target mix based on your age and comfort with risk. And then, this is the step almost everyone skips. Actually write it down somewhere. A note on your phone, something that says, "This is my plan," so that 6 months from now, when something scary shows up in the news, you have something to return to besides panic. Now, here's a piece of this that almost nobody talks about, and honestly, it's the part I find most interesting, because it's not really about math at all. It's about your nervous system. A cluttered portfolio doesn't just cost you in fees and inefficiency. It costs you in attention. Every extra holding is one more thing to think about, one more headline that suddenly applies to you, one more reason to open the app and check. And checking, on some level, most of us already know this. Checking is where the damage happens, not the owning, the checking. There's a well-known pattern in behavioral finance. Investors who check their portfolios most frequently tend to make worse decisions on average over time. Not because looking makes the market move, obviously, but because looking creates more opportunities for an emotional decision to sneak in. You see a dip, you feel a jolt of anxiety, and 30 seconds later you've sold something you probably should have held for 30 years. I want you to meet Grace. Grace isn't a finance professional. She's just someone who, a few years back, decided she was done managing a portfolio like it was a part-time job. Before that, Grace was checking her account almost daily, sometimes more than once, convinced that staying on top of it made her a better investor. It didn't. It mostly just gave her a low-grade sense of dread on a loop. The week she consolidated most of her scattered holdings into a small handful of broad funds, that daily anxiety more or less evaporated within a couple of weeks. Not because her returns suddenly changed, because there was simply less for her brain to latch onto and spiral about. 3 funds moving together in a slow, predictable way generates a lot less anxiety than 20 positions all sending you slightly different, slightly alarming signals. Here's why this matters to you. Retirement isn't a math problem you solve once and close the laptop on. It's a behavior you sustain for 30, 40, sometimes 50 years. And the portfolio that actually wins isn't the one with the highest theoretical return on a spreadsheet. It's the one you can actually stick with through recessions, through rough stretches, through your own moments of doubt, without blowing it up out of fear. Simplicity, in a very real sense, is a performance feature, not just a convenience. So, here's something worth being honest with yourself about. If you're opening your investment app daily, ask what it's actually giving you. Useful information, or just a steady feed of low-grade anxiety? For most long-term investors, checking in once a quarter, or even just twice a year, is genuinely more than enough. Let's talk about fees for a second, because this is where complexity quietly turns into real money leaving your pocket, and it's admittedly one of the least thrilling topics in finance, which is probably exactly why so many people never look closely at it. Here's the general shape of it. Actively managed funds, Layered fund-to-fund products and portfolios stacked with proprietary offerings tend to carry meaningfully higher ongoing costs than simple, broad index-style funds. And that gap, compounded across several decades, isn't a rounding error. It's frequently the difference between retiring comfortably and retiring anxiously. A seemingly small difference in annual fees, stretched across a full working career, can quietly consume a surprisingly large chunk of your total savings, not because any single year feels dramatic, but because that extra cost compounds right alongside your growth, quietly eating a slice of every year's gains before you ever see them. Think of it like a slow leak in a tire. You don't notice it day to day, the car still drives fine, but months later you're wondering why you keep stopping for gas more than you used to. Fee drag works the same way. It doesn't announce itself, it just quietly slows you down, mile after mile, until the destination you eventually reach is meaningfully short of where you could have landed. The more moving parts a portfolio has, the more likely it is that costs are stacking on top of each other somewhere inside it. A fund-level cost, maybe a management cost, sometimes a platform cost, each one small enough to seem forgettable, and each one compounding to be anything but. So here's the actionable step. Find the expense figure listed on every fund you currently own. It's usually right on the fund's summary page. And if you see something meaningfully higher than a basic broad fund, ask yourself honestly what you're getting in return for that extra cost. So let's bring this together into something you can actually use. Start with your time horizon. How many years until you'll actually need this money? That single number does more to shape your ideal mix of stocks and bonds than almost anything else. Generally, the further away retirement is, the more room you have for stock-heavy growth, since you've got time to ride out the rough patches. As retirement gets closer, gradually shifting more into bonds helps cushion the portfolio, so a bad year or two right before or after you retire doesn't derail everything. From there, choose your core building blocks. And again, this doesn't need to be exotic. A broad domestic stock fund, a broad international stock fund, and a bond fund covers an enormous amount of ground for most people. Some people prefer an all-in-one target date style fund that automatically adjusts this mix over time. A completely reasonable choice if you want the simplest possible version of this. One fund, one decision, done. Then set a schedule for checking in. Not daily, not weekly, but once or twice a year, to rebalance if things have drifted meaningfully from your target, and otherwise genuinely leave it alone. Doing nothing, consistently, over a long stretch of time, is one of the most underrated skills in personal finance. So if there's one thing to take from today, it's this. The anxiety you might feel about your portfolio not being complicated enough is usually pointed in exactly the wrong direction. The goal was never to build the most intricate portfolio possible. It was never about having an answer for every market scenario. The goal has always been to own a broad slice of the world's economic growth, keep your costs low, and stay invested long enough for time to do the rest. I think about Derek sometimes, the 23 Holdings guy. What actually changed for him wasn't some genius insight about markets. It was permission. Permission to simplify and to stop treating his portfolio like a hobby that needed constant tinkering. So maybe this week, take 20 minutes, log in, look at what you actually own, and ask yourself honestly whether it's simple enough to stick with for the next 30 years. If this helped, hit like, drop a comment with where your portfolio stands right now, and subscribe for more of this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.